Snow had erased the prairie down to its bones. Fence posts showed 2 inches above the drifts. Telegraph poles stood like black splinters in a field of white that moved and roared and had no edges. From beneath one drift, a mound that might have been a hill, might have been a house, a single thread of chimney smoke climbed into the still air above the wind line and dissolved. Tied to the saddle of the only horse on the road, 3 woolen blankets swung with each step, one for each person inside. No one on the rescue party expected to find a reason to bring them back folded. May of 1880 had not finished with Marit Brika when the railroad foreman placed $9.80 into her hand and closed her fingers around the coins as though she might drop them. The leather strap that should have held the timber to the wagon lay coiled at her feet, black with her husband's blood. Tolliff had been dead 4 hours. The foreman wanted her off the grading site before the next crew arrived. Marit walked the 4 miles back to the claim, carrying the coins in her apron pocket, where they knocked against her hip with every step. She did not cry on the road. Crying required a privacy she could not afford, because Oline and Anders were sitting on the dugout step waiting for their father to come home, and the distance between the railroad cut and the homestead was exactly the distance she had left to decide what her face would show them. She told them before supper. Oline went still. Anders asked when his father would be finished being dead. That night, Marit sat at the table with the cash box open and a stub of pencil in her hand. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was simply fatal. $38 in the box. $9.80 from the foreman. That gave her $47.80 to hold a homestead claim. Feed 3 people, maintain 1 milk cow, 2 brood sows, 6 young hogs, and 11 hens. Repair a dugout that leaked in 3 places. Replace the 3 missing window panes before autumn, and survive a winter she had been warned could arrive as early as October. Against that $47 stood $27 owed to Leander Crowell by the 1st of October. $15 minimum for roofing boards and stove repair. 6 tons of hay for the livestock if she intended to keep any of them breathing past January. 8 cords of fuel if the dugout stayed as drafty as it was. Flour enough for 3 mouths through winter would require either a successful crop or cash she did not have. She wrote the numbers in a column and drew a line beneath them. The sum on the wrong side of the line was larger than anything on the right side. She wrote it anyway because a number written down was a thing that could be divided and attacked. A number floating in her head at 2 in the morning was just fear. The children had no relatives closer than Wisconsin. Railroad passage east for 3 people, and whatever livestock she could sell at departure prices would consume nearly every cent and surrender the claim entirely. Tolliff had filed on 160 acres. The improvements, such as they were, belonged to the filing. Walking away meant losing the labor of 2 years, the graves of 2 miscarried children buried near the creek, and every promise Tolliff had made about what this land would become. Walking away was not a genuine option. It was a fantasy dressed as a plan, and Marit had stopped believing in fantasies the moment the foreman pressed those coins into her palm. She closed the cash box and went to check the hogs. 3 days after Tolliff's burial, Darius Penfield arrived on a gray horse with a surveyor's chain over his saddle and a leather notebook in his coat. He had come as an official witness to record the condition of the unfinished improvements on the Brecky claim. The county required documentation when a filing holder died. Penfield was 59, a former military road engineer who had been surveying Dakota claims since the railroad crossed the James River. He walked property lines the way a doctor examined a patient. Slowly, thoroughly, and without much interest in the patient's feelings about the diagnosis. Marit followed him around the dugout. She had expected questions. Instead, Penfield dictated to his own notebook as though she were not present. One door facing north, he said. Roof pitch too shallow. She will lose the sod in the first hard rain. Half the sod layer has already slipped on the east side. 3 window panes missing. Stovepipe joint is cracked below the collar. He stopped at the woodpile. Less than 2 cords cut. She needs 8 minimum if the structure remains as it is. He walked to the shallow cellar beside the dugout and climbed down the 4 earthen steps. Marit heard his boots squelch. Penfield came back up, wiping his hands on his trousers. The creek lies above your cellar floor when it floods, he said. You have standing water in the south corner right now. That wall is clay over loose fill. One good rain, and the whole thing slumps. Marit asked what he estimated the repairs would cost. Penfield looked at her for the first time, as though she were a person rather than an entry in his ledger. Repairing this dugout, relocating the cellar above flood level, gathering adequate fuel, purchasing provisions. At least $120, or 2 able-bodied laborers working through autumn. I have $47, Marit said, and no laborers. Penfield wrote something in his notebook and closed it. Mrs. Brecka, I have recorded claims across 3 counties. I have seen widows hold property, and I have seen widows buried on property. The difference is usually arithmetic. He paused at his horse. That hole will keep nothing dry. It will bury the 3 of you before the snow does. He did not say this with cruelty. He said it the way a man describes weather, as a condition that does not care whether you agree with it. Marit watched him ride south toward the Mitchell Road and felt something worse than anger. She felt the possibility that he was correct. Penfield had not reached the first section marker when Leander Crowell's wagon appeared on the north track. Crowell was 44, thin at the shoulders and heavy at the jaw, a provisions dealer who had arrived in Mitchell with the railroad and understood that profit on the frontier came not from selling goods, but from lending against goods that had not yet been grown. He held paper on a dozen homesteads. Tollef's debt, $38 for lumber, was secured against the livestock and tools. Crowell considered the debt a minor investment. What he actually owned was a claim to improved land that the railroad's westward expansion would make more valuable each year. He stepped down from his wagon carrying a document case. Mrs. Brecky, he removed his hat. I heard about Tollef. A terrible loss. He looked at the dugout, the slipped sod, the missing panes, the short woodpile. He looked at the shallow cellar where Penfield's boot prints were still visible in the mud. I have come with an offer, Crowell said. I will cancel the debt, every cent, in exchange for the hogs, the cow, and voluntary abandonment of the claim. You would leave free of obligation. The children could travel east without the weight of this place around their necks. He presented it as mercy. His voice carried the practiced gentleness of a man who had made this speech before. Marit asked what he intended to do with the claim. Crowell smiled. Improve it, properly. With whose labor? That is not your concern once the paper is signed. Marit looked at the document case. She looked at the hogs rooting along the fence line. She looked at the dugout where her children were eating cold corn mush because she had not yet repaired the stove. No, she said. Crowell's smile did not fade. It rearranged itself into something patient and thin. Mrs. Brecka, winter deaths in this territory are commonly recorded as exposure. The coroner does not write stubbornness on the certificate, but that is often the cause. He tucked the document case under his arm. You will come to me before October. I am certain of it. He climbed onto his wagon. Before he released the brake, he looked back at the dugout one more time. "A widow with a crowbar is still a widow," he said. "Stone does not care how badly she needs it to move." The wagon rolled south. Marit stood in the yard until the dust settled. Then she went inside and tried to lift a roof pole that had shifted during the last rain. Her left shoulder, the one damaged when the wagon overturned during the journey west, seized halfway through the lift. The pole hung at an angle, too heavy to raise and too dangerous to release. Oline appeared beside her and took the other end without being asked. She was 9 years old and weighed perhaps 60 pounds. Together, they walked the pole back into its cradle. That evening, rain struck the half-repaired roof. Water ran down the inside wall and pooled on the floor near the shallow cellar steps. Marit heard a sound she had been hearing for weeks without understanding it. A ceramic knock, regular and hollow, like a slow clock. She took the lantern to the cellar steps. An empty crock had floated off the lowest shelf and was bumping against the wall with each small surge of water entering from the saturated clay. She stood on the top step and listened past the knocking. Below the muddy floor, beneath the water and the clay, she heard something else. A thin, irregular trickling, water draining through a single narrow crack, while the surrounding ground held its moisture like a sponge, refusing to wring. Marit set down the lantern. She found the iron rod Tolef had used for testing fence post depth. She drove it into the crack in the cellar floor and pushed. The rod sank through mud. It sank through wet clay. At roughly 4 feet, it struck something that did not feel like clay. The impact traveled up the rod and into her wrists with a sound she recognized from her father's Wisconsin farm, the flat, clean note of iron meeting stone. She pulled the rod free. Brown water filled the hole. She watched the water level. It did not rise. It sank slowly, the way water behaves when it has somewhere else to go. Marit wiped the rod and drove it in again, 2 feet to the left. Same depth, same sound, same disappearing water. She did not know yet what lay beneath the clay floor of her failing cellar. But she knew one thing that Penfield and Crowell did not. Somewhere below this ground, water moved downward instead of standing still. And anything that moved water away from stored food was worth understanding. The next morning, Marit pried up 2 floorboards in the dugout above the cellar's lowest corner and began to dig. At 2 feet, she was still in the same sticky gray clay that made every wall in the cellar sweat. At 4 feet, the clay compacted and darkened. At 6 feet, the iron rod had not lied. The material changed. Brown, fine-grained, dense enough to resist her spade, but soft enough to fracture along horizontal lines. She pried a fist-sized piece free and carried it into daylight. The stone was not granite. It was not limestone. It was something between soil and rock, layered, porous when she held it to the light, and cool to the touch even in the June sun. She left the fragment on the step beside the stove and went back to digging. That evening, the fragment had dried without crumbling. She could scratch it with her thumbnail, but not break it in her hands. She pressed a damp cloth against it and waited 10 minutes. The cloth dried before the clay sample sitting beside it had even begun to lose its dark sheen. The next day, she dug 3 more samples. One from the shallow cellar wall, one from the test shaft at 6 feet, one from an exposed ledge she found on the creek bank a 1/4 mile downstream, where spring runoff had scoured a small bluff clean. She carried all 3 to the dugout and repeated the test. The shallow cellar samples stayed clammy for hours. The creek bank sandstone dried, but it was coarser and crumbled at the edges. The shaft sample dried cleanly and held its shape. Then she poured water against the shaft sample's edge and tilted it. The water spread into the stone. She could see the wet line advancing, but when she held the piece vertically, the moisture traveled downward and dripped from the bottom corner. The stone absorbed water. It also released water. It was not a sponge that held everything. It was a passage that moved moisture through and let it go. The memory arrived without warning. Her father's farmhouse cellar in Wisconsin, built against a hillside. 3 walls of different material. He had taken her hand when she was 12 and pressed her palm flat against each one: wet fieldstone, cold brick, and dry sandstone. He told her the temperature was nearly the same on all 3. The difference was what she felt with her skin, not what a thermometer would show. Do not trust cold alone, he had said. Trust what the wall does with the water it touches. He had held a candle near the cellar floor and then near the ceiling, and she had watched the flame lean toward the floor vent when the air was cold, toward the ceiling vent when the candle's heat created a draft. Air moved when you gave it a reason and a path. Marit sat at the table that night with the 3 stone samples in front of her and a piece of wrapping paper smoothed flat. She did not have an engineer's vocabulary. She had her father's hands, her own observation, and a question that would not leave her alone. What if the stone beneath the dugout floor was not an obstacle to be avoided, but a room waiting to be opened? Not because sandstone was magical. Her father had never called it that. Because a chamber cut into dry stone above the level where groundwater stood, with surface water intercepted before it could reach the shaft, and with vents that let damp air rise and escape, might hold a temperature and a dryness that no shallow clay cellar could match. She sketched on the wrapping paper with her pencil stub a vertical shaft beginning beneath the dugout floor, because a separate outdoor entrance would be buried by the first serious snowfall and useless for the rest of winter. Total depth from the floor to the cellar bottom, 15 feet. Shaft interior, 3 feet by 3 feet, 6 inches, wide enough to lower a ham on a rope. Timber cribbing through the upper clay where the walls might shift. Below that, a chamber opened into the sandstone itself, 7 feet by 9 feet, with a central height of 6 feet so she could stand. A sump at the bottom, 18 inches deep, filled with rubble to catch any water that reached the floor and drain it into the porous stone beneath. Wooden slats holding every piece of food at least 8 inches above the stone surface. A clay curb built around the trap door so wash water and snow melt from the dugout floor could never run into the shaft. And 2 vents, one entering low in the chamber, the other exiting high, each fitted with a sliding wooden damper so she could control the draft. A cooler, drier lower level for cured meat, a slightly warmer upper level for squash, beans, and sealed crocks. Total excavation, somewhere between 22 and 26 tons of clay and friable sandstone carried up a 15-foot shaft by hand. She stared at the number. Then she folded the paper and put it in the cash box beside the $47.80. 20-some tons. 1 woman with a bad shoulder, 2 children, and a deadline that smelled like snow. Nellie Barlow found her the next afternoon. Nellie lived on the next claim south, a practical woman of 36 with 4 children, a conventional 5-foot root cellar, and a husband who was working the harvest circuit in Minnesota and would not return until September. She and Marit had shared labor twice, once at butchering, once at soap making, and Nellie considered herself the closest thing Marit had to a friend in Davison County. She found Marit standing waist-deep in a hole in the dugout floor. "Lord in heaven," Nellie said from the doorway. "What are you doing?" Marit explained. She showed the stone samples. She described the 2-zone design, the sump, the ventilation. She unfolded the wrapping paper sketch. Nellie listened with the expression of a woman watching someone she cared about make a serious mistake. "Marit, every day you spend underground is a day you are not cutting hay. You need 6 tons for the livestock. You have not begun. I dig before sunrise and after the children sleep. I farm during daylight. The stone could collapse. I test the shaft after every rain. If water rises from below instead of entering from above, I stop. Even a perfect cellar is an empty box unless you raise enough food to fill it. I know. Then why are you down there instead of in your garden? Marit climbed out of the hole. Clay streaked her arms to the elbows. Her left shoulder sat lower than her right, held stiff against the rotation that triggered the old injury. Because I've watched my cellar flood twice since Tolef died, she said. If I spend the summer growing food and curing meat and storing it in a hole that fills with water every time it rains, I will have worked twice and lost everything once. The cellar must come first. The food follows the place that can hold it. Nellie looked at the shaft opening. She looked at the wrapping paper sketch. She looked at Marit's hands, which were already split along the thumb joints from the iron rod and the spade. What happens if your experiment fails in September? Then I will still have September, Marit said. If I wait until September to learn, I'll have nothing. Nellie picked up the dried sandstone sample and turned it in her fingers. She did not say the plan was wise. She did not offer help. But she set the sample down gently, and when she left, she took Anders and Oline to her own dugout for supper, without being asked. That night, Marit sold one of the 2 brood sows to a farmer 3 miles west. She used the money to purchase salt, rope, and 16 feet of sawn timber from a source that was not Leander Crowell. The shaft was 4 feet deep. 14 tons of stone and clay remained below her, and the first October frost was 119 days away. Word of the shaft spread the way everything spread in a settlement of 40 families, through women at the well, men at the livery, and children who could not keep a secret past sundown. Crowell heard that Marit had sold the sow to another farmer instead of surrendering it toward his debt. He took the news personally because he took all money personally and because the sow represented a piece of his collateral walking off the Brecky claim in someone else's wagon. He retaliated the following week. When Marit sent Oline to his store for salt and lamp oil, the girl came back empty-handed. He said we have no credit, Oline reported. He said to tell you. Crowell did more than cut credit. He described the shaft to every customer who entered his store. He called it the Breck Grave and said it with the small smile of a man who enjoyed his own wit. The phrase stuck. Within 10 days, men on the Mitchell Road slowed their wagons near the claim to listen for the sound of digging beneath the house. Children dared one another to press their ears against the dugout wall. One family from the church offered to take Oline and Anders until their mother returns to her senses. Marit refused. She did not explain. She went back underground. Crowell came himself on a Tuesday, carrying a written notice. He stood in the dugout doorway and read it aloud while Marit climbed the shaft ladder with clay in her hair. If payment of $27 is not received by October 1st, I will claim the tools, livestock, and harvested grain permitted by the debt agreement. He folded the notice. I am within my rights, Mrs. Brecka. He walked to the open shaft and looked down. The lantern at the bottom threw weak light against brown stone walls. You cannot store a promise, Crowell said. Marit reached into her apron pocket and produced $7, folded damp with sweat, earned over 2 weeks by washing railroad workers' shirts at the grading camp and selling eggs door to door in Mitchell. Crowell counted the bills twice. His face showed something worse than anger. It showed disappointment. He had wanted the full default, not a partial payment that proved she was fighting. He pocketed the $7 and looked at the shaft again. He picked a sandstone chip from the pile beside the opening and dropped it. The chip fell for a long silent moment before it struck the bottom with a flat crack that echoed up the wooden cribbing. That, Crowell said, is how far your children will fall. He left without signing a receipt for the $7. Marit had to call after him. He signed it on his wagon seat, pressing so hard the pencil nearly tore the paper, and handed it to Oline because he did not want to touch Marit's hand. Marit nailed a temporary railing around the shaft opening before she lowered herself back down. The social cost reached her children before it reached her. Oline came home from the church school silent and dry-eyed in the way that meant she had been crying earlier and had stopped. Marit did not press. That evening, while grinding corn, Oline said she had told another girl that her mother was building a room where weather cannot reach. The teacher had corrected her in front of the class. Weather reaches everyone, Oline. Your mother will learn that with the rest of us. Marit put down the grinding stone. The rage she felt was not at the teacher, but at herself, for building something that made her children carry the weight of her stubbornness in a room full of children who had fathers and complete houses and cellars that were not called graves. She nearly stopped. She sat at the table with the wrapping paper sketch in the cash box and thought about Crowell's offer. Cancel the debt. Give up the hogs and the cow. Walk east to Wisconsin with $47.80 minus the $7 already paid and the $15 spent on salt and timber. $25. 3 train tickets. Start again in a place that did not require her to dig through stone by lantern light while her children ate insults at school. Then she heard a sound from the shaft. She took the lantern to the opening and looked down. Oline had climbed the ladder. She was standing on the landing at 8 feet, holding a candle near the wall the way Marit checked the air each morning. The flame leaned gently toward the low vent opening and held steady. Clean air. On the stone beside her, Oline had scratched marks in chalk, copying the measurement notations Marit made each time she deepened the shaft. The marks were crooked, and the numbers were wrong, but the method was exact. Marit did not tell her to come up. She climbed down and stood beside her daughter, and they looked at the brown stone wall together in the candlelight. The wall was dry. The air smelled like dust and clay, not like rot or standing water. Is it deep enough? Oline asked. No, Marit said. Not yet. Then we should keep going. They climbed back up. Marit replaced the temporary railing and covered the shaft opening with boards for the night. She checked the hogs, the cow, the chicken coop. She lay down beside Anders, who had coughed twice during supper. Outside, the June sky stayed light past 9. 111 days until the frost. 14 feet to go. The stranger arrived in the second week of July. Marit had spent the morning expanding the shaft below the clay layer, where the sandstone began. The work changed at this depth. Clay could be dug with a spade. Sandstone required the iron rod used as a chisel, a hand sledge, and patience. She would score a line along a bedding plane, drive the rod into the score, and lever until a slab separated. Then she loaded the slab into a bucket, climbed the ladder, hauled the bucket up by rope, carried the slab to the discard pile, and climbed back down. She was averaging 7 trips per hour. Each trip moved roughly 40 pounds. Each 40 pounds represented 1/700th of the total weight she needed to remove. Her hands had stopped bleeding and started building calluses that cracked at the edges. The shoulder locked every third morning, and she had learned to work through the lock by swinging the sledge with her right arm alone until the joint released with a sound like a green stick bending. She did not hear the man until he spoke. "You have chosen the right stone," he said from somewhere above her, "but you are entering it from the wrong side." Marit looked up. A man stood at the top of the shaft, backlit by July sun, holding a sandstone chip in his remaining fingers. He was missing the index and middle finger of his left hand. The chip was one she recognized. The piece Crowell had dropped. "Who are you?" she asked. "Aslak Tveit," the man said. "I work the railroad culvert crew. I found this stone in the road beside your house. He was 58, Norwegian born, white haired at the temples and brown everywhere else from decades of outdoor labor. He spoke English with the same Western Norwegian accent Marit's parents had carried, the one that turned every J into a Y and swallowed the ends of words. Come down if you want to see the stone, Marit said, or leave if you want to stand above me and talk. Aslak came down. He moved on the ladder the way a man moves in a place he understands, feet finding the rungs without looking, one hand on the timber, the other trailing the wall. At the bottom, he took the lantern from its hook and held it close to the stone face Marit had been cutting. He asked 3 questions. Where did the water enter after the last rain? Marit pointed to the north wall, where a damp streak ran along a horizontal line and disappeared into a crack near the floor. Did the stone fracture along these horizontal lines, or does it break irregularly? Along the lines, Marit said. Always. When I try to cut across them, the stone splits where it wants to, not where I score it. How long did the candle remain bright when you first reached this depth? I watched it for 1 hour the first night. It never dimmed. Aslak set down the lantern. He produced a small mason's hammer from his belt, a tool with a flat face on one side and a chisel edge on the other, smaller than Marit's sledge, shaped for control rather than power. He tapped the stone at the point where Marit had been cutting, a high, clear ring. He moved 3 inches to the left and tapped again, a flat, dead sound. There, he said, pointing to the flat spot. Clay seam, shale parting. If you cut there, the wall will talk to you for a week, and then it will move without warning. He tapped back to the ringing spot. Here, the bed is tight. It will resist you, but it will not lie about where it is willing to separate. Marit stared at the wall. She had been cutting into the flat spot for 2 days. Most people dig until a wall frightens them, Aslak said. You have been watching the wall change. That is different. He climbed the ladder and waited at the top. Marit followed. In the daylight, she could see the quarry scars on his remaining fingers, the railroad dust ground into the creases of his neck, and the way he held the damaged hand without hiding it or favoring it. I do not need charity, she said. I do not offer charity, Aslak said. I need evening meals, use of that broken wagon for hauling culvert stone, and half the proceeds if the sandstone you remove can be sold for foundation work in town. The stone is too soft for foundations. Some of it, not all. I will teach you to hear the difference. Marit looked at the pile of discarded stone beside the dugout. She had been throwing away material she did not know how to evaluate. When do you want to start? She said. I already started, Aslak said. You were cutting into the wrong seam. He did not smile, but he held up the sandstone chip, the one Crowell had dropped to measure the depth of her children's future grave, and set it on the railing post like a marker. This stone told me more about your shaft than Crowell intended, he said. It rang when I dropped it. Dead stone does not ring. He walked back toward the railroad camp. Marit watched him go and felt something she had not felt since the foreman pressed the coins into her hand. Not hope. Hope was a luxury. What she felt was the possibility of a method, a way to read what lay beneath her instead of merely attacking it. She went back down the ladder and moved her cutting line 4 inches to the right into the ringing stone. The first strike sent a clean note up the shaft and out into the prairie air, where it mixed with the sound of meadowlarks and the distant hammer of the railroad crew building westward across land that did not yet know what it owed to the people who were trying to stay. Aslak returned the following evening carrying his tool roll and a coil of rope thicker than anything Marit owned. He ate the supper she had prepared, boiled beans, cornbread, a cup of milk from the cow, and said nothing about the food's quality or quantity. He ate the way working men eat, steadily and without conversation, and when the plate was clean, he stood and walked to the shaft. "Show me your ladder," he said. Marit's ladder was two cottonwood poles with cross pieces nailed at 14-inch intervals. It leaned against the south wall of the shaft and reached from the dugout floor to the sandstone landing at 8 feet, where the chamber would eventually begin. Aslak tested each cross piece with his boot. Two flexed. He pulled them free and replaced them with oak strips from his tool roll without asking permission. "Your ladder is also your hauling path," he said. "If you stand on it while a loaded bucket passes, the bucket owns the ladder and you own nothing. They cannot share the same space." Over the next 3 days, he rebuilt the shaft's working system from the top down. First, a windlass. Two forked posts set into the dugout floor on either side of the shaft opening, a cottonwood axle between them, a crank handle, and the heavy rope wound around the axle. The windlass sat directly over the center of the shaft. The ladder moved to the north wall, away from the bucket's path. Second, a rawhide brake strap, a strip of untanned hide wrapped once around the axle, so that releasing the crank did not send the bucket into free fall. Aslak made Marit practice the brake until she could stop a 40-pound load at any point in the shaft without jerking the rope. Third, alternating crib timbers. Through the upper 6 feet of clay, where the walls were soft enough to shift, Aslak locked squared timbers in alternating courses. Each layer rotated 90 degrees from the one below, pressing outward against the clay like a box built from the inside. The cribbing turned the unstable upper shaft into a rigid collar that would hold, even if the surface froze and heaved. Fourth, two hauling buckets. One rested at the bottom being loaded while the other rode the windlass to the top. When Marit filled one, she climbed the ladder, cranked the full bucket up, dumped it, sent the empty bucket down, and descended to fill the other. The rhythm cut her hauling time nearly in half. He taught her one rule above all others. Never stand below a suspended load, not to adjust it, not to steady it, not because you think the rope will hold. The rope does not know what you think. The rule saved her life on the 4th day. Marit was on the ladder at the 6-foot mark when the handle on the upper bucket, a bent iron strap she had fashioned from a wagon brace, tore free from the stave. The bucket fell straight down the center of the shaft and smashed the lower ladder section where Marit had stood every morning for 3 weeks before Aslak moved it. The sound was enormous. Stone chips sprayed across the chamber floor. Anders screamed from the dugout above. Oline ran to the shaft edge and looked down. Marit was pressed against the north wall on the relocated ladder, untouched. Her hands shook on the rungs. Aslak looked down from the windlass. "That is why," he said. He did not elaborate. He pulled the broken bucket up, replaced the handle with a proper forged bale from the railroad supply, and sent it back down. Marit descended and resumed filling. Her hands did not stop shaking for an hour. The third lesson came during a July cloudburst. Marit woke to the sound of water hitting the dugout roof in sheets. She pulled on her boots and checked the shaft. Dry. She checked the shallow cellar, 2 inches of water already pooling against the south wall. By morning, the water had crossed the dugout floor. A thin stream ran toward the shaft opening, divided by the temporary clay ridge Marit had built around the trap door, and pooled against the north wall of the house instead. Aslak arrived soaked. He did not go underground. He walked uphill. 50 yards above the dugout, the prairie sloped gently toward the house. Runoff from 200 yards of open grassland funneled into a natural swale that aimed directly at the north wall. Every rainstorm sent a broad sheet of water against the dugout, where it soaked through the sod, saturated the clay beneath, and eventually found every crack, joint, and shaft opening on its way downhill toward the creek. "Your cellar does not have a water problem," Aslak said. Your house has a water problem. The cellar just catches what the house cannot hold. They spent 2 days cutting a shallow diversion trench across the slope above the dugout. The trench was 18 inches wide, 8 inches deep, angled to spill runoff east toward a low spot that already drained to the creek. At the dugout's north wall, they laid a gravel apron, crushed sandstone from the discard pile that kept pooling water away from the sod. Inside, they rebuilt the clay curb around the trap door into a proper collar 8 inches high, sealed with clay paste and tamped until it was harder than the surrounding floor. At the shaft bottom, they excavated the sump, 18 inches deep, 2 feet square, filled with progressively smaller stone, fist-sized rubble on the bottom, gravel on top, creating a drainage reservoir that could absorb water entering the chamber without letting it stand against the walls or reach the storage racks. "No stone stays dry if you invite water to stand against it," Aslak said. He made Marit repeat this while they tamped the sump. "The stone does its work only if you have done yours first." That night, Marit recorded the lesson in her own words on the back of the wrapping paper sketch. Water must be turned before it arrives, not mopped after it enters. The weeks measured themselves in stone removed and food preserved. End of June, shaft at 8 feet, cribbing complete, the clay collar sealed. Marit's hands had developed a second layer of calluses over the first, thick and yellow along the heel of each palm. Mid-July, sandstone reached across the full shaft floor. Aslak showed Marit how to score expansion lines along the bedding planes and drive wooden wedges into the scores. The wedges were soaked in water overnight. As they swelled, they opened the stone along its natural seams with less force than the sledge required, and with fractures Marit could predict instead of fear. She learned to listen. A sharp crack meant the stone had separated cleanly. A grinding sound meant the fracture was crossing a clay seam and might veer. A dull thud followed by silence meant the wedge had hit dead stone that would not move, and she should pull it, rescore, and try a different angle. End of July. First 5 feet of the chamber opened. The room was taking shape in the sandstone. A rough rectangle with its long axis running south and east, away from the damp shale band Aslak had identified on the north wall during his first descent. The original plan had called for 7 by 9 feet. The shale band stole 1.5 feet. The chamber would measure 7 by 8.5 feet, with a 6-foot ceiling at the center and a shallow arch that Aslak said would distribute the weight of the stone above better than a flat roof. Mid-August, 18 wagon loads of broken sandstone and clay hauled to the discard pile. 3 loads sold to a farmer building a chimney foundation. Aslak split the proceeds as agreed. $4.30 to Marit, the same to himself. $4 would not change the arithmetic, but Marit entered the number in her ledger with the same care she gave every other figure. Money that came from the shaft was money that proved the shaft had value. First week of September, the chamber roof reached its final shape. Aslak inspected every foot of the arch with his hammer, tapping in a grid pattern and marking the few spots where the stone rang flat instead of clear. At those spots, they drove short timber supports into the ceiling and wedged them tight. Marit built the lower racks from cottonwood slats, 8 inches above the stone floor, as the plan specified. No food would touch rock or soil. The air beneath the slats would circulate, and any moisture that somehow reached the floor would drain toward the sump instead of wicking upward into stored meat. The upper racks went in next, narrower shelves at shoulder height, where the chamber temperature ran 3 to 5 degrees warmer than the floor. These would hold the squash, the dried beans, the sealed crocks of lard and sorghum. Mid-September, lower racks installed, upper racks half finished. one ventilation shaft operating. The high vent, a narrow wooden duct rising from the chamber ceiling through the sandstone and clay to exit at ground level behind the dugout. The low vent, which would admit cold, dry air near the floor, remained a hole in the chamber wall with a rough passage cut toward the surface, but no damper and no protective cap. October 1st, both vents nominally open. The high vent drew well. The low vent admitted air, but also admitted dust, insects, and prong. After one rain, a trickle of muddy water that ran down the passage and pooled on the racks before Marit caught it. She packed clay around the entrance and cursed while Aslak watched without helping, because this was a mistake she needed to fix herself. By the 10th of October, Marit estimated she had removed 24 tons of material. She had lost 11 pounds. Her boots no longer fit tightly around calves that had been thick with muscle in May. The shoulder locked every morning now, not every third morning, and the locking lasted longer each time. She hid the severity from Aslak until he caught her hauling a bucket with only her right arm on the windlass, while her left hung at her side, trembling. He did not tell her to stop. He adjusted the brake strap so the windlass required less force to hold, and told her to use 2 hands or stay out of the shaft. While the stone came out, the food went in. 5 hogs fattened across the summer on garden waste, failed corn, and grain screenings purchased with the last of Aslak's stone sale money. By September, the largest weighed over 200 pounds. Marit slaughtered in the order her mother had taught her. Heaviest first, because a hog that stops gaining weight is burning feed for nothing. She selected 8 hams and several shoulders for dry curing. Each ham was rubbed with coarse salt mixed with a handful of brown sugar and a dusting of black pepper. She packed them in a wooden trough, weighted them with sandstone slabs, and left them in the cool shade behind the dugout for 21 days, turning each piece every 3rd day and repacking salt where the brine had dissolved it. After curing, the hams hung in a small smokehouse Marit had built from scrap lumber and clay. The fuel was a mix of hickory chips, arrived as packing waste inside a crate of tool handles shipped to the railroad, and local hardwood with dried corn cobs. She kept the fire low. Smoke, not heat. Aslak told her that a hot smokehouse cooked the outside and left the center raw, while a cool smokehouse built flavor down into the muscle and let the salt do the deeper work of preservation. 2 hams showed spoilage near the joint after the curing period. The bone had stayed warm while the surrounding meat took salt, and bacteria had found the gap. Marit discarded both without hesitation. She could not afford to lose 2 hams, but she could afford even less to store meat that would rot in the vault and contaminate the air. 68 Hubbard squash cured on raised boards in the September sun. Each one turned every 2 days. Marit checked the stems. A hard, dry stem meant the squash had sealed itself and would hold for months. A soft or cracked stem meant the squash would fail by December. She sorted ruthlessly. 49 passed inspection. 19 went into immediate cooking or the hog trough. 11 bushels of corn and beans dried on cloth in the dugout during warm afternoons and went into cloth sacks sewn shut with heavy thread. Salt came in 3 separate purchases from 3 sources because Crowell's store was closed to her, and she refused to let any single supplier know the full quantity she was accumulating. The vault was not merely a hole in the ground. It was the final step in a chain that began with feeding hogs the right scraps and ended with hanging a cured ham on a rack 8 inches above dry sandstone in air that moved at a speed Marit controlled with 2 wooden dampers. Each piece of food that entered the chamber represented a decision Marit had made weeks or months earlier. The vault did not create the food. It held the consequences of every correct choice and exposed every incorrect one. October 14th, the high vent collapsed. Marit discovered it in the morning when she descended to check the overnight temperature. The chamber felt different, not warmer, stiller. The air hung instead of moving. She held the candle near the high vent opening, and the flame stood straight. No draft. She climbed the shaft, crawled behind the dugout, and found the vent surface exit buried under 4 inches of wet clay that had slumped from the roof line during the night's rain. The clay had sealed the wooden duct completely. Beneath the clay, the duct itself had shifted where it passed through the transition between sandstone and the wet clay above. The joint had opened, the clay had entered, and the vent was dead. The temperature outside that morning was 31 degrees. The sky to the northwest was the color of a bruise. The historical October blizzard reached eastern Dakota on the 15th. Marit, Aslak, and the children retreated inside the dugout before noon as the wind crossed 40 miles per hour and the temperature fell toward 0. Snow drove horizontally across the prairie. The cow and remaining hogs huddled in their sod-walled pen. The chickens went silent in their coop. Below the dugout floor, the chamber still held 46 degrees. But without the high vent, the moisture from 3 breathing people, a cook stove, and the open trap door had nowhere to escape. By the second morning, condensation beaded on the lower chamber ceiling. One ham, the one nearest the blocked vent, developed a wet, tacky surface. Marit scraped the moisture with a cloth and rehung the ham, but she knew the cloth was a bandage, not a repair. Without the vent, every hour put more water into the air than the stone could absorb. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. Penfield arrived on foot. He had been surveying a section marker 2 miles east when the blizzard struck and had spent 2 nights in a sod house that was not his own. He looked gaunt and furious. He descended the shaft without invitation. He examined the damp ceiling. He examined the tacky ham. He looked at the blocked vent passage from below and said nothing for a long time. "This is what I warned you about," he said. "You have built a room that works only when nothing goes wrong. The first storm took your ventilation. The first damp day threatened your meat. What happens when January gives you 30 storms instead of 1? Marit expected Aslak to defend her. The vault was sound. The problem was one vent joint in the clay, not the design itself. Aslak looked at the damp ceiling and the tacky ham. "Penfield is right," he said. The silence that followed was worse than any of Crowell's insults. Marit had believed that Aslak, of all people, understood what the vault could do. His agreement with Penfield felt like the ground shifting beneath her, the one ally she trusted siding with the man who had told her the hole would bury her children. "A good idea does not become safe because winter arrived," Aslak said. "Fix the vent, then store the meat." They reopened the blocked passage through frozen ground. It took a full day. Aslak chiseled a new channel through the clay, while Marit held a fire pot at the surface to soften the frozen layer above him. The new joint was packed with gravel instead of clay, allowing water to drain around the duct instead of pressing against it. When they finished, Aslak tested the draft with a candle flame. It leaned, the air moved. The tacky ham went back on its hook. Within 2 days, the surface dried. But the lesson was written on Marit's face for the rest of the season. The vault would work only as long as she worked for the vault. It was not a room she could close and forget. It was a living system that required reading every day, the way Aslak read stone. 3 days after the vent repair, Nellie Barlow appeared at the dugout carrying 2 lengths of stovepipe under one arm and her oldest son under the other. The stovepipe came from a ruined shed on an abandoned claim west of her farm. She had walked a mile through ankle-deep snow to retrieve it. "I still think your cellar is a gamble," Nellie said, "but I do not want the gamble decided by a piece of clay falling on a wooden pipe." They installed the stovepipe sections above the chamber, replacing the topmost portion of the wooden duct where it passed through the wet clay layer. Metal would not absorb moisture, swell, or collapse under the weight of saturated earth. The lower sections remained wood-lined, where the passage ran through dry sandstone and the risk was low. Nellie's son helped haul the old wooden sections out, while Oline held the lantern. It was the first time anyone from outside the Breka household had descended the shaft voluntarily. When they finished, Nellie stood in the chamber for a full minute. She touched the wall. She looked at the racks. She looked at the 6 cured hams hanging in the dry lower section and the rows of squash on the upper shelves. She did not say the vault was brilliant. She said, "It is warmer down here than in my house." Tell us in the comments, have you ever been dismissed until someone finally saw the work for themselves? November brought the cold that stays. Aslak taught Marit to operate the vents by adjustment rather than by leaving them fully open or fully closed. Cold, dry air admitted through the low vent during clear, still weather would sink to the chamber floor and push warmer, damp air upward through the high vent. During blowing snow, both vents were reduced to openings no wider than 2 fingers, preventing drifting snow from entering while still allowing a thread of circulation. They hung a spirit thermometer in 3 positions: at the shaft landing, at the lower meat racks, and at the upper squash shelves. Marit recorded the readings every morning and every evening in a notebook Aslak gave her, one of his own quarry notebooks, half filled with sketches of culvert arches and bedding plane diagrams. The readings held. Dugout room overnight with the stove dying, 26 degrees near the floor. Shaft landing, 36 degrees. Lower chamber at the meat racks, 46 degrees. Upper squash shelves, 51 degrees. The sump contained no standing water after 2 autumn storms. 1 ham, a marked test piece, lost weight steadily without becoming tacky, exactly the slow drying that meant the cure was deepening rather than the surface was rotting. The squash stems remained hard and the skins unbroken. The beans and corn smelled dry when Marit opened a sack to grind meal. Aslak placed a saucer of coarse salt in the center of the chamber. If the salt clumped and dissolved, the humidity was too high. If it remained loose and dry, the air was moving properly. He warned Marit that this was observation, not science. It told her direction, not degree. But direction was enough. Penfield returned in early December. He descended the shaft with his surveying notebook and his habitual expression of a man expecting to record a failure. He read the thermometer. He touched the walls. He examined the sump, the vent passages, the cribbing. "The temperature is holding," he admitted. "I cannot explain why the walls are dry when the ground above is frozen and wet." He looked at Marit. "You have tested cold," he said. "You have not tested floodwater." Nellie, when told the readings, raised the same point from a different angle. Any cellar can look successful before the snow melt. Crowell, through the general store gossip network, predicted that Marit would open the trapdoor in March and find mold from floor to roof. The first major December storms closed the railway intermittently. Flour prices in Mitchell doubled. Coal became scarce. Families who had measured their winter provisions against a normal supply schedule discovered that normal had ended in October and was not coming back. Marit began recording every meal, every pound removed from storage. every egg collected, every cup of milk. The numbers were not encouraging, they were merely precise. Precision was the only weapon she had against the fear that precision itself could not solve. In mid-December, Aslak moved back to the railroad camp to help maintain culverts threatened by frost heave. He would be 2 miles away, then 5, then wherever the crew sent him. Before he left, he gave Merritt his plumb bob, a brass weight on a string, scored with a crosshair on the bottom face. It was the tool he used to establish true vertical in every shaft, culvert, and drainage channel he had built for 30 years. When you are frightened, Aslak said, measure before you decide. He walked east along the frozen track. The light was thin and blue. Marit watched until he became a dark line against the snow, and then a point, and then nothing. She descended the shaft and hung the plumb bob from a nail in the ceiling. It turned slowly in the faint draft and settled into stillness, pointing straight down at the dry gravel sump. The room was hers now, the room and the winter and the 3 small lives that depended on what the room could hold. January came with its teeth. The first storm struck on the 3rd and did not fully release the prairie for 4 days. Wind drove snow horizontally past the dugout at speeds that turned flakes into needles. The temperature on the 4th night dropped to 22 degrees below zero. Marit read the thermometer at the window and wrote the number down, and then went to the shaft because the number was only useful if she knew what the chamber was doing in response. Lower chamber, 44 degrees. 2 degrees below the autumn average, but well above freezing. The squash was firm, the hams hung dry, the sump was empty. A second storm arrived before the snow from the first had stopped moving, then a third. The intervals between storms shortened until the word interval lost its meaning. There was wind and there was less wind, but there was always snow, falling, blowing, drifting, compressing under its own weight into a substance harder than the soil it covered. Rail service failed completely. By the 3rd week of January, the Brika claim had been reduced to a chimney. The fence post nearest the dugout showed 2 inches above the drifts. The north door was sealed behind a wall of packed snow taller than Marit. She maintained exit through the south-facing window, which she had reinforced with a wooden shutter that could be opened inward. Each morning she climbed through the window, dug a trench to the livestock pen, watered and fed what animals survived, and retreated inside before the next gust erased the trench. The cow's milk production fell to half a quart a day. The hogs ate sparingly and huddled together. Then Anders stopped eating. He had been coughing since November. A dry, barking cough that worsened at night. In the 3rd week of January, the cough became wet. His forehead radiated heat. He curled into the bed and refused water. Marit could not reach Mitchell. She could not reach Nellie. She could not reach anyone. She knew what the fever needed: warmth, fluids, rest, and warmth again. Steady, sustained warmth that did not fluctuate every time the stove burned low. But keeping the dugout warm enough for a sick child meant burning fuel at twice the normal rate. Merritt's woodpile had been calculated for a cold winter, not a siege. By the end of January, she had burned through most of the split wood. She began twisting hay into tight cylinders and feeding them into the stove the way the old-timers had described: fast-burning, low heat, constant attention. The hay twist fire kept the room above freezing, but could not hold the steady warmth Anders needed without Marit feeding it every 20 minutes through the night. The warmer she kept the room, the more vapor entered the shaft every time she opened the trapdoor to retrieve food. Frost built around the shaft collar. Ice crystals formed on the top 3 rungs of the ladder. She monitored the chamber twice a day. Lower racks, 45 degrees, upper racks, 50. The sump had collected a thin layer of moisture, not from below, but from the warm air entering through the trapdoor and condensing on the cooler walls. The system was holding, but it was being pushed. In the first week of February, the high vent stopped drawing again. Marit knew it immediately. The candle flame at the vent opening stood dead still. The air in the chamber felt thick. She climbed through the window, tied the rope around her waist, and gave the other end to Oline with instructions that terrified them both. If I pull once, give me slack. If I pull twice, pull me toward the chimney. If I do not pull at all for a count of 100, pull me toward the chimney anyway. She crawled across the drift on her hands and knees. The wind was not at its worst. She could see the chimney 6 feet away as a dark smudge, but the vent exit was buried under 2 feet of packed snow mixed with ice. She dug with her hands because the shovel had been lost in a drift the previous week. She cleared the opening. The snow refilled it before she could retreat. She cleared it again and shoved a flat stone over the opening at an angle, creating a small protected cavity that would allow air to escape without filling immediately. On the way back, she lost sight of the chimney. The world was white in every direction, not blank white, moving white, a white that shifted and roared and had no edges. She could not tell up from down until she felt the rope at her waist and pulled twice. Oline pulled. The rope tightened. Marit crawled toward the tension and found the window. Her right cheek was frostbitten, a white patch below the eye that she did not feel until she was inside, and the heat brought the pain. She pressed a cloth soaked in cool water against it and waited for the sting that meant the tissue was alive. The vent drew weakly. It was enough. The candle flame leaned. The air began to move. February consumed them slowly. Marit counted food the way a besieged army counts ammunition. 6 sound hams, 3 smoked shoulders, 49 squash, minus the 6 she had already opened, 8 bushels of corn and beans, minus what had been ground, 2 sacks of flour, each one lighter than she remembered, 17 pounds of lard, 12 gallons of sorghum, milk declining as the cow's feed disappeared, less than 1 quart of solid fuel. The hay twists were running out, too. She reduced meals for herself and Oline. She refused to cut Anders's portion. Oline did not complain. She ate what was placed in front of her and went back to grinding corn, as though grinding were a profession she had chosen freely. In late March, the wind changed. It came from the south, warm, wet, carrying the smell of mud and rot instead of ice and mineral cold. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in nearly 3 months. Rain fell on accumulated snow. The sound was wrong, not the clean drumming of rain on earth, a hissing, sinking sound as though the prairie were dissolving. Water raced toward every low spot. Around Mitchell, shallow cellars flooded through their outdoor entrances. Flour sacks wicked water from standing pools. Potatoes sat in brown water. Salt barrels dissolved from below, the bottom staves collapsing inward. Cured pork stored on cellar floors absorbed enough moisture to begin souring within days. When the cold returned, because the cold always returned, exposed cellar entries froze shut, trapping ruined stores behind walls of ice. At the break of claim, the meltwater reached the diversion trench. Marit heard it before she saw it. A low, steady gurgling from the slope above the dugout, like a creek that had not existed the day before. She climbed through the window and saw water running along the trench exactly as Aslak had designed it, carrying snowmelt east toward the low ground. The trench held for 3 hours. Then an ice block, a chunk of compacted drift the size of a feed sack, broke free from the upper slope and rolled into the trench. It wedged across the channel and dammed the flow. Water backed up behind the ice, rose over the trench edge, and sheeted toward the dugout wall. Marit heard dripping inside the shaft. She lowered the lantern. Water shone on the north wall, the wall nearest the shale band, the wall Aslak had warned her about in July. A thin, steady drip followed the outside of one crib timber down from the clay into the upper shaft. If you are invested in Marit's fight, subscribe and stay with us, because the next sound from beneath that floor changes what everyone believes. Marit descended with the plumb bob. She hung it from the ceiling nail and watched it settle. Then she ignored it. The plumb bob measured vertical. She needed to know where the water was traveling. She pressed her hand against the north wall. Wet. She pressed the south wall. Dry. She checked the floor. Dry. She checked the sump. Dry gravel with no standing water. The drip was not rising from below. It was entering from above. Surface meltwater penetrating the clay layer and following the path of least resistance down the outside of the crib timber, which had contracted slightly during the winter freeze and opened a hairline gap between wood and clay. Water crossing, not rising, Aslak's distinction. She climbed back out and went outside. The ice block still dammed the trench. Water continued to sheet toward the house. Marit picked up the shovel and swung it one-handed against the ice block. Her right arm. The left shoulder had locked that morning and had not released. The ice cracked, but held. She swung again. The shovel blade rang against frozen snow. Her grip slipped. She caught the handle, reset her feet in the mud, and swung a third time. The block split. Water surged through the gap and resumed its eastward course, but the damage was done. Meltwater had reached the dugout wall. It would seep for hours. Marit scrambled back inside and called to Oline. "I need you to cut a second channel, downhill from the first trench. Angle it south toward the creek bank." Oline took the shovel. She was 9 years old, and she drove it into frozen mud with a sound like a hatchet splitting green wood. The girl dug for 30 minutes while Marit descended the shaft and packed clay around the leaking timber joint, pressing it into the gap with her thumbs until the drip slowed, stuttered, and stopped. She placed the empty bucket beneath the repair. Over the next 3 hours, the bucket collected less than a quart of water. Then the drip stopped entirely. Lower chamber temperature fell from 46 to 43 degrees. The upper racks held near 49. The hams remained dry. The squash remained firm. The sump gravel remained dry. The vault had taken a blow. It had not broken. In Mitchell, the thaw accomplished what 3 months of blizzard had not. It destroyed stored food. Crowell's cellar flooded through its outdoor stairway. The stairs acted as a funnel, channeling meltwater directly onto the storage floor. His flour sacks collapsed into paste. Barrels of apples overturned in rising water. Meat stored too close to the damp floor developed the sweet, sick smell of rot within days. Crowell hauled what he could into the store above ground, but when the cold returned, it froze the cellar door shut and burst several stoneware crocks whose contents had absorbed water and expanded as they iced. Nellie's shallow cellar took 18 inches of muddy water. Her potatoes and carrots survived in a diminished state. Her flour, beans, and cured pork were soaked beyond use. Across the settlement, families opened cellar doors onto standing water, frozen surfaces, and the unmistakable smell of food that would not last until planting. The winter had not starved them. The thaw had. At the railroad depot, Aslak, Penfield, and a dozen men sheltered together and rationed what provisions remained in the town supply. Rumors reached them. The Brecca dugout had vanished beneath a drift. The chimney had stopped producing smoke 2 days ago. A child's mitten had been found frozen into the snow near the north wall. Penfield organized a rescue party. 3 men, snowshoes, a horse, and 3 woolen blankets. Crowell volunteered to accompany them. He brought a separate list, an inventory of the livestock and tools he intended to claim once the bodies were removed. They reached the bricky claim in the early afternoon. The dugout was invisible. The north wall lay behind an 8-foot drift of packed snow that had consolidated during the freeze-thaw cycle into something closer to ice than powder. The men found the mitten first. Olean's mitten, small, brown, frozen into the outer drift at the level where a child's hand would reach if she were trying to push through snow toward the outside world. Penfield stared at it. Crowell looked at his inventory list and then looked away. They began to dig. The work took hours. 3 men with shovels cutting a trench through blue-white ice, moving 6 inches at a time, stopping when the surface refroze around their blades. The horse stood downwind and steamed. Penfield's shovel struck wood. He cleared a hand-sized gap in the drift above the doorframe. Warm air rose through the gap, carrying the smell of smoke, salt, and cured pork. Inside, Marit had moved the stove against the south wall and was burning her last solid wood. Anders lay on the bed, thin and pale but conscious, his fever broken 4 days earlier. Olean sat beside the grindstone, turning corn into meal with the steady rhythm of a machine. Crowell stared through the gap. "What remains below?" he asked, pointing at the trapdoor. Marit answered without looking at him. "Enough to feed the men who came expecting to carry us out." She unlatched the trapdoor and lowered a lantern. The men looked down. 6 cured hams hung on their hooks, dry-surfaced and dark with smoke. Rows of Hubbard squash lined the upper shelves, stems hard, skins unbroken. Bean sacks stood upright on slats above dry gravel. The spirit thermometer read 43 degrees. The sump held no water. 1 single drop hung from the repaired shaft joint, caught the lantern light, fell into the empty bucket, and did not follow with another. Marit climbed the ladder, built up the stove fire, and fried ham. She boiled beans. She cut 2 squash and roasted them in the coals. She set the food on the table for the men who had brought blankets for her children's bodies. Penfield ate without speaking. Aslak, who had joined the party at the depot, descended the shaft and spent 10 minutes examining the walls, the sump, the cribbing, the vent passages, and the repaired joint before he came back up and sat beside the stove. Crowell ate the food placed before him. He chewed slowly, as though the act of eating required more concentration than usual. He did not mention his inventory list. He did not mention the debt. He sat in the dugout of the woman he had called a widow with a crowbar and ate the ham her vault had kept dry while his own cellar filled with floodwater and his own stores rotted in their barrels. Nobody spoke about what this meant. The food spoke for itself. Outside, thaw water refroze across the prairie. The 8-foot drift sparkled in the late light. Beneath the dugout floor, the chamber held its temperature, its dryness, and the months of preparation that had turned a hole in the ground into the only room within 20 miles where winter had not reached the food. The rescue party left the break claim carrying more food than they had brought. Marit sent 2 squash and a portion of beans with Penfield for families at the depot. She did not send a ham. The hams were her deepest reserve, the food that would carry her children through planting season if the spring turned cruel again. She watched the men cross the drift field from the window. Crowell's wagon had been left at the Mitchell Road because the snow was too deep for wheels. He walked, carrying a squash under each arm like a man who had forgotten how to hold ordinary things. Anders slept. Olean ground corn. Marit descended the shaft and inspected every rack, every surface, every joint. No standing water in the sump. Less than 1 quart had entered through the repaired shaft joint during the entire thaw event. 6 hams remained sound. She pressed each one with her thumb, checking for give beneath the cured surface, and found none. 43 squash remained after the rescue meal. The lower chamber temperature had dropped to 42 degrees at its coldest during the crisis, but had never threatened freezing. The upper zone had held near 49. She opened the notebook and recorded the numbers. Then she sat on the bottom rung of the ladder in the lantern light and pressed both hands against the sandstone wall. Dry, cool, unchanged. The wall had done what her father's Wisconsin cellar wall had done. It had let moisture pass through instead of holding it, and the sump and the vents and the gravel and the clay collar had managed everything else. Not because sandstone was magic, because every piece of the system had a job, and no piece had been asked to do a job it could not perform. She climbed back up, closed the trap door, and fed Anders a cup of broth made from ham bone and dried corn. Aslak came alone 2 days later. He did not come to celebrate. He came to inspect. He descended the shaft with the mason's hammer and tapped every foot of wall, ceiling, and arch in the same grid pattern he had used during construction. He checked the cribbing for frost damage. He examined the vent passages from below. He ran his hand along the repaired joint and studied the clay Marit had packed around it. He found 2 cracked timbers in the crib. Frost heave had split them along the grain during the coldest week. The cracks did not threaten immediate collapse, but they would worsen with each freeze-thaw cycle. They needed replacement before next winter. He checked the sump drainage, still clear. He checked the low vent damper, which had developed a slight warp from moisture absorption, functional but imprecise. He noted it. Only after the full inspection, 20 minutes of silence, tapping, measuring, and frowning, did he speak. The room survived because she changed the design when the stone changed. He said this not to Marit, but to Penfield, who had accompanied him back to the claim and stood at the shaft opening looking down. Aslak wanted the surveyor to hear the verdict in technical terms, not emotional ones. The vault had not survived because Marit was brave or stubborn or blessed. It survived because when the north wall showed a shale band in July, she had rotated the chamber away from it instead of cutting through it. When the clay proved unstable above the sandstone, she had installed cribbing instead of hoping. When the vent collapsed, she had rebuilt it with better materials instead of sealing it shut. When the thaw sent water against the shaft, she had diagnosed the entry path instead of panicking. The room worked because the builder had listened to the room. Penfield descended the ladder. He was not a small man, and the shaft was tight for his shoulders. He stood in the chamber with his notebook open, recording dimensions, temperatures, and observations in the same careful hand he used for section lines and quarter-corner stakes. He looked at the hams. He looked at the squash. He looked at the sump. "I told her the hole would bury them," he said. "The truth is that she understood where the water would travel better than I did." He paused, and the quality of his pause was that of a man who was accustomed to being correct and was attempting to locate the precise language for being wrong. "I do not suggest that anyone dig a shaft without testing the formation, supporting the walls, and providing drainage," he said. "I suggest that Mrs. Brecka did all 3, and I failed to observe it because I expected her to fail." Aslak said nothing. He let Penfield's words stand in the stone room like a temperature reading, a fact that could be recorded, checked, and compared against what had come before. They climbed back up. Penfield shook Marit's hand at the doorway. He did not smile. He did not say he was proud of her. He said he would note the vault's performance in his county surveyor records so that future claims officers would know that subsurface storage in the region was feasible under specific conditions. It was the most generous thing a man like Penfield could offer. Not praise, but documentation. The news traveled the way Crowell's mockery had traveled, through women at the well, men at the livery, children who had seen the rescue party return carrying food instead of blankets. But the story that spread was not the story Marit would have chosen. What spread was a miracle. A widow had dug a magic hole in magic rock, and her food had survived while everyone else's rotted. The sandstone was special. The woman was blessed. The cellar was a wonder that ordinary people could not replicate. Marit heard the miracle version from Nellie, who arrived 3 days after the rescue party with her 4 children, and an expression that mixed admiration with deep practical concern. "They are saying you found a special kind of stone that keeps everything dry," Nellie said. "Jens Holmstad has already started digging beside his well because he thinks his rock is the same as yours." "His well sits in the water table," Marit said. "He will flood his own cellar in a week." "That is what I told him. He did not listen to me. He might listen to you." Nellie's conversion was not a single dramatic moment. It had been happening since the October night when she carried stovepipe through the snow. But standing in the dugout now, watching Marit descend the shaft and return with a squash for Nellie's children, the conversion completed itself. "Show me," Nellie said. "Not the room. Show me what you look for when you decide where to build." Marit took her to the creek bank where the sandstone was exposed. She showed Nellie the bedding planes, the horizontal lines where the stone could be separated with a wedge. She showed her the shale partings, the darker bands that held moisture instead of passing it. She showed her the difference between stone that rang when struck and stone that thudded. "The ring means it is tight," Marit said. "The thud means there is a gap inside, clay, air, water. You do not cut into the thud." Nellie struck the stone with a borrowed hammer and listened. She hit it again in a different spot. "I can hear the difference," she said, surprised. "Everyone can hear the difference. Most people do not know they should be listening." Nellie asked about her own cellar, the 5-foot pit that had taken 18 inches of floodwater. Could it be improved without digging deeper? Marit walked the property with her. She showed Nellie where roof runoff pooled against the cellar entry. She showed her where the slope above the house channeled snow melt toward the foundation. She pointed to the cellar floor, which sat below the surrounding grade and acted as a collection basin for every drop of water that reached it. "Your cellar is not too shallow," Marit said. "It is too low. Water finds it because you have given water no reason to go anywhere else." She sketched a plan on the back of a feed receipt, a diversion trench above the house, a gravel apron at the cellar entrance, a raised wooden floor inside the cellar, a single vent at the high point to let damp air escape. "This will not make your cellar into mine," she said, "but it will stop your cellar from becoming a well." Nellie took the sketch and studied it as though it were a land deed. Over the following weeks, other families came. Jens Holmstad came after his well-side excavation filled with 3 feet of brown water overnight. He was embarrassed and angry, and he wanted someone to blame. "You told people the rock was the secret," he said. "I dug into rock and now I have a pond." "I told no one that the rock was the secret," Marit said. "Other people told you that. The rock is part of the system. The drainage is part. The ventilation is part. The site is the first part, and your site sits in standing water." She made Holmstad fill his hole back in. She walked his property and found a slightly higher spot behind his barn where the ground drained naturally toward a low swale. If he wanted to build a proper cellar, he would build it there, with a trench above it and a gravel sump below it. He would not dig deeper than the water table, which he estimated at 9 feet on his land. He would install 2 vents. He would keep his meat off the floor. Homestad did not thank her. He said he would think about it. He came back a week later and asked her to mark the spot with stakes. A widow named Cora Strand asked Marit to inspect a dugout cellar that had always smelled of mildew. Marit found no ventilation at all. The cellar was a sealed pit beneath a trap door. Air entered when the trap door opened and was trapped when it closed. Every warm, damp breath the family exhaled while cooking above condensed on the cold cellar walls below. "Your food is breathing the same air you breathe," Marit said. "It needs its own air." She showed Cora how to cut a simple vent through the cellar wall using a hand drill and a length of wooden pipe. The vent exited at ground level behind the house, protected from rain by an angled board cap. A week after installation, the mildew smell was gone. Cora's butter, which had been turning rancid within days of churning, stayed clean for 2 weeks. These were not miracles. They were adjustments based on observation. Marit refused to call sandstone superior. She refused to call her vault a model for everyone. Her first lesson to every family was the same. Look where the water goes when it rains, because that is where the water will go when the snow melts, and that is where your food will drown. Watch, measure, change the path. During these weeks of teaching, Aslak and Marit worked on something new, a demonstration cellar built into the side of a fire steel creek bank where the sandstone was exposed and the drainage ran naturally downhill. Not a household cellar buried beneath a floor, an exterior cellar with its own entrance, visible to anyone who wanted to study the construction. They divided it into 2 rooms, a cooler, moister room on the lower side, near the creek bank floor, where root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips, could tolerate the humidity that would destroy cured meat. Marit lined the floor with gravel and the walls with hay insulation that could be replaced each season. A drier, slightly warmer room on the upper side, above the root room, where squash, dried grain, cured meat, and sealed containers needed low humidity and steady temperature. This room had the better ventilation. 2 ducts, 1 high and 1 low, with wooden dampers Marit had copied from her own design. A central passage connected the rooms and led to a drain that ran downhill through the bank and exited in daylight at the creek edge. Water that entered the cellar at any point would follow the passage floor to the drain and leave under gravity. No pump, no bucket. The drain was the room's most important feature, and it was also the simplest. A gentle slope in the right direction. Aslak insisted that the drain exit be visible from outside. Anyone walking past could look at the bank and see whether water was running from the cellar. If no water appeared after a storm, the drain was blocked and needed attention. If water appeared constantly, groundwater had risen and the cellar needed to be closed until conditions changed. They worked side by side in the way of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythm. Aslak cut stone, Marit set timbers. He did not tell her where to place them. She did not ask. When she chose a wrong angle, he waited until she noticed and corrected it herself. When she chose a right angle that he would have done differently, he accepted her choice because the room was no longer his. It was hers. And differences in method that produced the same result were not errors, but variations. He began calling her the builder when townspeople came to ask him questions about cellar design. "Ask the builder," he would say, and point to Marit. The first time he said it, Marit looked at him as though he had spoken in a language she almost remembered. Then she turned to the farmer who had asked and answered the question. Summer deepened. Aslak's cough, which had been present since the first winter, grew heavier. He paused more often during work. His hammer strikes lost their precision. The flat face drifted off center. The chisel edge missed the score line. He noticed before Marit did and compensated by working more slowly. But the compensation cost him time, and time was the one resource he measured more carefully than stone. One evening, after they had finished setting the demonstration cellar's roof timbers, Aslak sat on the creek bank and watched the water run clear over the exposed sandstone ledge. "I built culverts in Wisconsin that are still standing," he said. "I built drainage for a railroad that is still running, but the canal work, the first work, that is all gone. They filled it in when the railroad came through." Marit sat beside him. She did not fill his silence. She waited. "My wife told me I gave my best work to channels that would carry other people's goods," he said. She was right. I gave the stone my hands, and I gave the railroad my fingers, and I gave the canals the years she wanted for herself. He held up the three-fingered hand. "This is what the quarry kept when I left." Marit asked if he regretted the work. "I regret the assumption," he said. "I assumed the stone would always be there, that I could go back and build what I wanted after I'd finished building what others required." He tapped the creek bank ledge with his hammer. The stone rang clear. "The stone is always there. I was not." They sat until the light left the water. Aslak said he intended to travel to Wisconsin to see his married sister. His cough needed a warmer roof and a closer doctor than anything Mitchell could provide. Marit asked when he would return. "When the cough tells me I can," he said. Before leaving, he gave Marit the stone hammer, the mason's tool with the flat face and the chisel edge that he had carried for 30 years. He also gave her the remaining quarry notebooks, half filled with sketches of arches, drainage grades, bedding plane patterns, and culvert cross-sections. Some pages showed European storage rooms, vaulted stone chambers beneath farmhouses in Norway and Germany, drawn from memory or from descriptions his father had given him. One page showed a quarry face in Wisconsin with annotations in Norwegian. Marit could read enough of his handwriting to understand. The annotations described the sound each section of wall made when struck. He had been mapping stone by ear for decades. He asked her to correct him on one point before he left. "I thought I was teaching you to trust stone," he said. Marit waited. "Stone should never be trusted," he said. "It should be read again every day." He walked east along the railroad track for the last time. Marit watched from the same spot she had watched from in December when he left for the culvert crew. The light was different now, summer gold instead of winter blue, but the figure growing smaller against the distance was the same, and the feeling was the same, and the knowledge that the next time she needed an answer, the answer would have to come from her own hands and her own observation, and the notebooks of a man who had given her his tools, because he understood that tools outlive the people who make them useful. News of his death arrived the following February, carried by a letter from his sister. The cough had been consumption. He had died in a boarding house in Eau Claire, in a room that faced east. Marie received the letter at the table where she kept the cash box and the wrapping paper sketch and the notebooks. She opened the oldest notebook, the one with the European storage drawings, and a line of pale dust fell from the fold where the pages met the spine. Stone dust, ground into the paper by years of handling, years of a hand pressing the page flat while the other hand sketched. The dust lay across the table in a thin line, and Marit looked at it for a long time because the line was the shape of a hand that had rested there once and would not rest there again, and the room around her was very quiet, and the air through the vents moved the way it always moved, carrying nothing heavier than the damp it was designed to carry, and nothing lighter than the silence it could not. She closed the notebook. She descended the shaft and checked the racks. June of 1883, arrived with the kind of rain that makes people remember floods they had hoped to forget. Firesteel Creek rose through the first week. By the second week, it had overtopped its normal banks and spread across the low fields in a brown sheet that swallowed fence posts and chicken coops. The communal demonstration cellar sat above ordinary flood level. Aslak had chosen the site. Marit had confirmed it. The drainage calculations were sound for any flood that stayed below the creek's historical high water mark. This flood did not stay below the historical mark. On the 9th day of rain, debris, a tangle of cottonwood branches, fence wire, and mud washed down the creek and lodged against the bank directly below the cellar's drainage exit. The drain backed up. Water stopped flowing out. Within hours, water began pooling in the central passage. It had not yet reached the storage rooms, but it was rising toward the threshold of the lower root room, where 16 sacks of seed wheat, the town's planting supply for the following spring, were stacked on raised pallets. Nellie's son discovered the problem and ran to the Brecka claim. Merritt arrived at the creek bank to find 4 men standing outside the cellar entrance arguing about what to do. 2 wanted to move the seed immediately into Crowell's warehouse. 1 wanted to dam the passage. 1 wanted to abandon the cellar and salvage what they could. None of them had gone inside. Merritt went inside. The passage floor held 2 inches of water. The root room door was still above the waterline by 4 inches. The upper storage room was dry. The ventilation ducts were functioning. The structure was not collapsing. She came back out and said 3 things. First, move the grain from the lower room to the upper room. It is dry. It is above the water, and it can hold the weight. Second, shore the passage ceiling with the timbers stacked beside the entrance. If the bank shifts, the ceiling must hold long enough for people to exit. Third, I need 2 men to clear the drain from outside. Crowell's wagon arrived while she was speaking. He stepped down with 2 hired men and the expression of a man who has been waiting for a failure he can supervise. That grain belongs to the cooperative, he said. I have offered to store it in my warehouse. My warehouse is dry. The cellar is flooding. Your warehouse is across the low road, Marit said. The low road is under 2 feet of water. The wagons will not cross without soaking the grain worse than it is now. I will accept the risk. You will accept the risk because the grain is not yours. If it drowns on your road, you will sell us replacement seed at double the price. Crowell's jaw tightened. The men standing behind Marit shifted their weight, but did not move toward Crowell's wagon. Marit turned her back on him and walked to the cellar entrance. Nellie, bring your son inside. We are moving sacks. Homestad, take the shovel to the drain outlet and start clearing debris. Whoever is fastest with a saw, cut bracing timbers to fit the passage ceiling. She did not ask, she instructed. And the men and women of the cooperative followed her into the cellar because she had been right about the vault beneath her own floor, and she had been right about their drainage trenches, and she had been right about Homestad's well-side disaster, and the accumulated weight of being right when it mattered carried more authority than Crowell's money or his warehouse or his practiced voice. They moved the seed sacks in relay. 2 people inside passing sacks from the lower room through the passage to 2 people at the upper room door. Each sack weighed 60 pounds. Marit carried them one-armed when her shoulder locked. Nellie carried them with both arms and a sound between a grunt and a prayer. The hired men Crowell had brought stood outside and watched until one of them, a young railroad laborer who had no loyalty to Crowell's agenda, set down his hat and joined the line. Outside, Homestad and 2 others attacked the debris dam with shovels and an axe. The cottonwood branches were tangled with wire and packed with clay. They cut, pulled, and pried for 40 minutes. The water in the passage rose to 4 inches. Then 5. Then the drain opened. The sound was immediate. A deep, throaty gurgle as backed up water found its path again and surged through the cleared exit onto the creek bank. The passage water level dropped an inch in the first minute, 2 inches in 5 minutes. By the time the last sack reached the upper room, the passage floor was damp but no longer pooled. Marit walked the upper room, 16 sacks of seed wheat stacked on dry slats. Not a single sack showed water damage. The lower room floor was wet but draining. The ceiling timbers they had installed would remain in place as permanent reinforcement. If this story reminds you why knowledge matters only when it is shared, send it to someone who prepares before the emergency arrives. Crowell stood outside the cellar entrance. His hired men had drifted toward the road. His wagon sat empty. He said nothing. He climbed onto the wagon seat and drove north through the mud toward a warehouse that contained flour, hardware, ammunition, and debt contracts, but no seed wheat and no community willing to store it there. The following spring, families planted from the saved seed. The wheat grew. The cooperative did not need to purchase replacement grain from Crowell at any price because the grain had not been lost, and the reason it had not been lost was that a woman who could not have lifted a single sack 2 years earlier had designed a room that knew where water belonged. Marit did not take credit in the way that Crowell would have taken credit, loudly, publicly, with his name attached to the outcome. She took credit the way a builder takes credit, by being present when the next family arrived with questions, and the next after that. She and Nellie established seasonal inspection days, twice a year, once before the first frost and once after the spring thaw. Every family in the cooperative opened their cellars and checked the same list: drainage clear, vents open and drawing, racks sound and elevated, food separated by type U, dry goods above, wet tolerant goods below, thermometer readings within expected range, any signs of condensation, mold, or standing water. The inspections turned individual experiments into shared knowledge. When Cora Strand's vent cap failed during a winter storm, 3 families already knew the repair because they had seen the same failure in their own cellars and corrected it using the metal pipe method Nellie had introduced at the Brika vault. Oline began keeping records, not just temperature readings, but comparative notes between cellars, which designs held temperature best, which vent configurations drew most reliably, which foods lasted longest under which conditions. She was 10 years old and she wrote in a child's hand, but the records were precise because her mother had taught her that precision was the difference between knowing and guessing. Penfield, on his rounds as county surveyor, used his level to mark drainage falls for 2 new cellar sites. He asked Marit to confirm the grade on the second site, and accepted her correction in front of 4 men who had once described her vault as a grave. "The fall is 1 inch short," she said. "Water will pool at the bend." Penfield measured again. She was right. He adjusted his stake without comment and wrote the correction in his notebook. That evening, Nellie told Marit what had happened. "He let you correct him in public," Nellie said. "That man has not been corrected in public since the war." "He was not corrected," Marit said. "He measured again and found I was right. That is not correction. That is surveying." Aslak had taught Marit to read stone. Marit had taught the cooperative to read water. What none of them had expected was that the method would create a new kind of problem, the problem of success. By the summer of 1883, families who had built improved cellars were losing less food to spoilage, which meant they had more food to sell or trade, which meant they depended less on Crowell's store credit, which meant Crowell's control over the settlement's economy was weakening one drainage trench at a time. Crowell responded the way any man responds when the foundation of his authority erodes. He attacked the foundation of theirs. He circulated a claim that Merritt's cellar was successful only because railroad timber and stolen town labor supported it. He told customers that the cooperative was a scheme to undercut honest merchants. He offered financing for community cellars, but his contracts required farmers to store a portion of their harvested grain in Crowell's warehouse as collateral. Any family that accepted his financing would give Crowell control over their seed supply, which was precisely the control the communal cellar had taken away from him. Merritt read the contracts. Nellie read the contracts. Penfield, who understood debt instruments from his military service, read the contracts. "He is selling you a cellar that stores his grain," Penfield said. Merritt organized the response. Instead of debt financing, each family in the cooperative contributed days of labor. Homestad contributed his team of horses for hauling stone. Cora Strand contributed food for the work crews. Nellie contributed organizational fury, scheduling the labor rotations with the same precision she applied to harvest crews. 2 new cellars were completed before the frost using cooperative labor and $0 of Crowell's money. Crowell petitioned the town trustees to declare deep indoor cellars unsafe. His petition cited Penfield's original warning about shaft collapse and bad air. He neglected to mention that Penfield had publicly retracted the warning after inspecting the Brecka vault. Penfield attended the trustees' meeting and stated for the record that the Brecka vault was structurally sound, properly ventilated, and correctly drained. He further stated that any cellar built using Mrs. Brecka's site selection and construction methods would be safe provided the builder followed the established rules. The petition failed by a narrow margin. 2 trustees voted in Crowell's favor. 3 voted against. The margin was uncomfortable. A single changed mind would have shut down the cooperative's expansion. Crowell left the meeting without speaking. His silence was louder than any insult he had delivered at the Brecky doorstep. Merritt knew the silence meant he was not finished. Men like Crowell did not lose margins. They remembered them. But for now, the work continued. Merritt and Nellie established 7 rules before helping any new family excavate. They wrote them on a board and hung the board inside the communal cellar entrance. No vertical shaft in loose sand. No chamber below standing water level. No unsupported clay deeper than the height of a person. No single vent. No meat touching stone or soil. No digging alone beneath a loaded roof. No claim that one chamber suits every crop. The 7th rule was Merritt's addition. Aslak had taught her to listen to stone. Experience had taught her that different foods listen to different conditions. Squash wanted dry air and moderate coolness. Roots wanted humidity and deeper cold. Cured meat wanted steady dryness and salt air, and enough circulation to keep the surface from sweating. Flour wanted absolute dryness and total isolation from anything that might carry moisture or insects. A single room could not serve all of them perfectly. The best cellar was a cellar with divisions, separate zones, separate racks, separate vent adjustments, so that each food occupied the environment it needed rather than the environment that suited its neighbors. This was not Merritt's invention. It was her father's observation, filtered through Aslak's engineering and tested by the worst winter in the settlement's brief history. The knowledge had traveled through 3 people, each of whom had shaped it according to their own experience, and what emerged was not a design, but a set of principles that could adapt to every site and every family's needs. The 2nd-generation communal design reflected these principles. An outside hillside entrance instead of a household floor shaft. Safer, easier to maintain, accessible without entering the house. A stone-lined drain with visible discharge. Replaceable timber lintels above doorways and passage ceilings. Separate high and low air ducts with sliding dampers. a small vestibule between the entrance and the first storage room, preventing sudden cold air from rushing across the stored food when the door opened. A thermometer board where weekly readings were recorded, removable slat racks that could be carried outside, scrubbed and dried in sunlight between storage seasons. And for the first time, the cellars stored seed grain as well as food. The innovation had expanded from survival to economic recovery. A family that could protect its seed supply through winter did not need to borrow from Crowell in spring. A family that did not borrow from Crowell in spring did not owe him a portion of the harvest in autumn. Each protected sack of seed was a link broken in the chain that had given one man control over 40 families' ability to plant. The cellar had become something larger than a room. It had become a kind of independence built into the ground. Crowell's final move came in the autumn of 1883, and it came not as a threat but as an accounting exercise. He appeared at the Brecka claim on a Tuesday morning carrying a leather document case and a recalculated debt statement written in his own hand. He had added interest charges from the original lumber advance. He had added transport fees for materials Tollef had received at the railroad site. He had added the replacement cost of salt he claimed Marit had been offered credit for and refused, which he now reframed as a service charge for the offer itself. He had added a storage fee for tools that had briefly sat in his warehouse yard during Tollef's first months on the claim. The total came to $41.60. Marit read the document at the table while Crowell stood in the doorway. Oline watched from the bed where she was mending a shirt. Anders was outside feeding the hogs. The original debt was $38, Marit said. I've paid $7. The balance is $31. The balance is $41.60, Crowell said. The additional charges are itemized. The additional charges are not in the original agreement. The original agreement permits supplementary charges at the lender's discretion. Show me that clause. Crowell opened the document case and produced the original debt paper, the one Tollef had signed in the spring of 1880, before the timber rolled and before the ground opened beneath Marit's floor. She read it line by line, running her finger beneath each word the way her mother had taught her to read English, slowly, missing nothing. The clause Crowell cited read, "Additional charges may be assessed for services rendered in connection with the original advance." Services rendered, Marit said. What services? Transport, storage, credit offered. Credit offered is not a service. Credit refused is not a debt, and Tollef transported his own lumber from your yard in his own wagon. His wagon was repaired with my tools. His wagon was repaired with his own hands. Your tools were borrowed for one afternoon, and Tollef split a cord of firewood for you in exchange. I have a witness. Crowell's expression shifted. The thin patience he maintained as a professional manner gave way to something rawer, the frustration of a man who had expected arithmetic to do the work his authority could no longer accomplish. You owe me $41.60, he said. If you cannot pay before harvest, I will claim the livestock and grain specified in the agreement. I will pay what I owe, Marit said. I will not pay what I do not owe, and I will settle the matter before the town trustees, with every receipt I have kept since May of 1880. She opened the cash box and produced a stack of paper scraps, feed receipts, torn envelopes, and one piece of wrapping paper, every record of every payment, purchase, and exchange she had made in 3 years. Each one was dated and annotated in her uneven handwriting. The $7 payment Crowell had counted twice was recorded on both sides of the same receipt. Her copy and his signed acknowledgment, retrieved when she called after his departing wagon. Crowell looked at the stack. He looked at Marit. He looked at the trap door in the floor. The trustees will hear my account, he said. Good, Marit said. Bring your receipts. The hearing took place in the back room of the general store, Not Crowell's store, but the smaller establishment run by a German family named Tebbe, who had no financial connection to either party. Penfield served as the examining officer. He was not a judge, but as county surveyor, he held the closest thing to impartial authority the settlement possessed, and both parties had agreed to his arbitration. Marit laid out her receipts in chronological order on the table. Crowell laid out his. The comparison took 2 hours. Penfield found that the original debt of $38 was legitimate and documented. The $7 payment was acknowledged by Crowell's own signature. The supplementary charges totaling $10.60 were not supported by any countersignature, receipt, or written agreement beyond Crowell's own ledger entries. The clause permits charges for services rendered, Penfield said. It does not permit charges for services imagined. Mr. Crowell, your transport charge refers to lumber that Mr. Brecky hauled himself. Your storage charge refers to tools that sat in an open yard for less than a week. Your credit offer charge has no precedent in any debt instrument I've examined in this territory. He turned to Marit's records. Mrs. Brecka has documented the $7 payment. The sow sale proceeds applied to salt and timber rather than to the debt, which was her right, as the agreement does not require all income to be directed toward repayment, and the approximate value of eggs and labor she has sold since 1880. He wrote a figure on a clean sheet of paper and pushed it to the center of the table. The legitimate remaining balance is $11.20. Crowell stared at the number. Merritt stared at it too. $11.20. Less than a quarter of what Crowell had demanded, less than the price of one of her cured hams at current Mitchell market rates. She reached into her apron pocket and counted out the money. Not from the cash box. From a separate fold of cloth that she had carried for 3 weeks. Fees collected voluntarily from families she had helped with cellar inspections. She did not charge for teaching. She did not charge for cooperative labor. But when families offered payment for her time and travel, a day spent walking a distant claim, an afternoon marking drainage grades, an evening explaining vent construction, she accepted what they offered and set it aside. $11.20 in coins and small bills placed on the table beside Penfield's written figure. Crowell counted it. He signed the release. He folded it and placed it in his document case and stood. "This is settled," Penfield said. Crowell walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. He did not speak. He left. Nellie, who had attended the hearing as Marit's witness, exhaled as though she had been holding her breath for 3 years. "It is finished," she said. "It is not finished," Marit said. "He still has a store. He still holds paper on other families. He is smaller today, not gone." She was right, but smaller was enough for now. The conversion, when it came, arrived not as an apology, but as a crisis that left Crowell no alternative. In the autumn of 1883, as families stored their harvest in improved cellars across the settlement, Crowell's own warehouse developed a problem he could not solve with arithmetic. Grain stored in the warehouse's lower level began heating. The signs were unmistakable to anyone who knew them. A sweet, heavy smell rising from the sacks. A warmth detectable by hand against the canvas. A slight dampness on the surface of grain that should have been bone dry after a summer of curing. Spontaneous heating occurred when moisture content was too high and ventilation too poor. Bacteria multiplied in the damp interior of the grain mass, generating heat that accelerated the process. Left unchecked, the grain could mold entirely. In extreme cases, it could smolder. Crowell discovered the problem himself during a routine inventory. He told no one. He moved sacks from the lower level to the upper level, hoping the drier air near the roof would arrest the process. It did not. The upper sacks simply joined the lower sacks in warming because the moisture was inside the grain, not in the surrounding air. He could not afford to lose the grain. It represented the stored harvest of 8 families who had contracted with him for warehouse space. If the grain spoiled, he owed them either replacement grain or the market value, a sum that would break his business. Marit smelled the problem before Crowell admitted it. She was passing the warehouse on a visit to the Tebby store when the sour, sweet odor reached her from 20 feet away. She stopped. She stood in the road and breathed in through her nose the way Aslak had taught her to smell stone, slowly, with attention, letting the scent separate into its components: damp grain, active heating, early mold. She walked into the warehouse without invitation. Crowell was standing beside a row of sacks with his hands behind his back and his face arranged into the expression of a man who has nothing to hide. The expression failed. His shirt was damp with sweat, and his eyes moved too quickly between Marit and the sacks. "You have heating grain," Marit said. "I have warm grain. It will cool." "It will not cool. It will heat until it molds or smolders. You need to open every sack, spread the grain on clean boards in moving air, and dry it before the moisture feeds any further, and you need to do it today." "I did not ask for your opinion." "The grain belongs to families. The families ask me to inspect their cellars. They will ask me about their grain." Crowell stood very still. The warehouse was quiet except for the sound of his breathing and the faint, continuous hiss of fermenting grain. "Why would you help me?" he asked. The question was genuine. For the first time in 3 years, Leander Crowell was asking Merritt Brake a question to which he did not already know the answer he wanted to hear. "Because the grain belongs to families even when the building belongs to you," Marit said. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Marit directed. Crowell's hired men hauled sacks. Nellie's son and Holmstadt arrived without being asked. The smell had reached the road, and anyone who had survived the hard winter knew what that smell meant. Every sack was open. The grain was spread across wooden pallets, wagon beds, and clean floor sections with space between the layers for air to circulate. The warehouse doors were propped open at both ends to create a cross-draft. Marit stationed a man at each door to turn the grain with a wooden rake every 30 minutes. By the second day, the grain temperature had dropped. The sour smell faded. The mold, which had appeared as a white dusting on perhaps a fifth of the total supply, was confined to the outer layers that had been closest to the damp floor. Marit had those portions separated, sacked and marked for animal feed rather than human consumption. The rest was saved. Crowell stood in his warehouse doorway on the second evening, watching Marit and Nellie supervise the resacking. The grain was going back into the same warehouse, but the lower sacks now rested on raised pallets instead of bare floor, and Marit had cut a crude vent through the rear wall using a borrowed hand drill and a section of stovepipe. "I was wrong about the Brake vault," Crowell said. Marit continued counting sacks. "I was more wrong about the woman who built it." He did not say this gracefully. He said it the way a man says something that cost him, through tight lips, with his eyes on the grain instead of the person he was addressing. The words were dragged out of him by the accumulated weight of evidence he could no longer deny. His cellar had flooded while hers stayed dry. His warehouse had heated while her vault held steady. His debt maneuver had failed in front of the same surveyor who had once supported his warnings, and now his grain had been saved by the hands of the woman he had called a widow with a crowbar. He did not become a different man. He did not embrace the cooperative or surrender his contracts or discover generosity in the place where self-interest had always lived. But he withdrew his opposition. He stopped calling the vault a grave. He stopped financing rival cellars with debt traps attached. He maintained his store, his warehouse, his position, but the position no longer included the authority to dismiss what Marit had built, because the evidence against dismissal now included his own grain drying on his own pallets by her design. Marit accepted the admission the way she accepted every piece of information. She recorded it, assessed its reliability, and filed it alongside everything else she knew about the man. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not the currency of the exchange. Accuracy was. Crowell had been inaccurate about her, and now he was less inaccurate. That was enough. Nam. By the autumn of 1884, the settlement around Mitchell had changed in ways that were visible to anyone who knew where to look. 12 farm families had built improved cellars using the principles Marit and Aslak had developed, not copies of the Bricka vault. Each one was adapted to its site, its soil, its drainage pattern, and its family's needs. 4 of the 12 used divided humidity zones. 3 used exterior hillside entrances. 2 used interior floor shafts like Marit's original, in locations where the soil and stone conditions justified the design. The town maintained one communal seed and emergency vault, the Firesteel Creek demonstration cellar, enlarged after the flood and reinforced with permanent timber bracing. It stored seed wheat, emergency grain, and a rotating supply of cured meat and dried vegetables contributed by cooperative families. Penfield kept copies of Marit's drainage sketches alongside his survey records, filed under the same reference system he used for section lines and township plats. He had added his own annotations, soil types, water table depths, seasonal flood levels, creating a composite document that combined Marit's practical knowledge with his engineering precision. Nellie supervised the seasonal inspections with the organizational discipline of a woman who had managed a farm, 4 children, and a harvest circuit husband for a decade. She had become the person families contacted first when a cellar showed signs of trouble. She could diagnose a blocked vent by the smell of the air at the trap door. She could estimate humidity by the feel of a stone wall under her palm. She had learned these skills from Marit, who had learned them from her father and from Aslak, and the chain of teaching had not weakened as it lengthened. It had grown more precise because each person who learned added their own observations to the shared knowledge. Olene's records filled 3 notebooks. She had invented a simple notation system: a column for date, a column for cellar name, a column for temperature, a column for vent position, a column for observations. The observations were written in a child's direct language. Strand cellar smells like wet cloth. Vent cap broken. Fix Tuesday. The records allowed comparison across cellars and across seasons. When Holmstad's rebuilt cellar showed a temperature spike in its second autumn, Olene's records revealed that the same spike had appeared in the Brecka vault during its first October out. The month when the ground above was still warm and the chamber below was adjusting to cooler air. The spike was normal. It passed. Without the records, Holmstad would have panicked and opened his stores prematurely. Food losses did not disappear. Spoilage still occurred. A family that cured their hams improperly still lost hams. A family that stored wet squash still found mold. A family that neglected their vents still found condensation on their walls. The cellars did not prevent every failure. What they prevented was mystery. When food failed, the family could identify why: too much moisture, too little air, too close to the floor, too near the shale band, too long without inspection. The failure became a lesson instead of a catastrophe, and the lesson improved the next season's results. This was Marit's deepest contribution, though she would not have described it in those words. She had not given the settlement a technology. She had given them a method of paying attention. Marit did not remarry. The subject arose in the way subjects arise in small settlements, through implication, suggestion, and the occasional direct inquiry from women who believed a widow with 2 children and a successful farm needed a husband the way a house needs a roof. Marit did not argue with the suggestion. She simply did not act on it. Her days were full. The farm demanded spring planting, summer cultivation, autumn harvest, and winter management. The cellars demanded inspection, teaching, and the occasional emergency repair. The children demanded education, clothing, discipline, and the particular kind of attention that motherless children require even when their mother is standing right beside them. The reassurance that she is not leaving, not dying, not disappearing into a hole in the ground. Her central relationships remained Oline and Anders, Nellie and the cooperative families, and the memory of Aslak that lived in the notebook she kept on the shelf above the trap door. Oline grew. She learned to read the thermometer and the vent dampers and the surface of a cured ham and the color of grain that was heating. She learned to listen to stone, though she would never develop the ear that Aslak had possessed, the ability to hear a fracture line before it became visible. What she developed instead was the ability to read records. She could look at 3 months of temperature readings and identify the week when something changed. She could compare 2 cellars' performance and explain the difference in terms of vent position, drainage grade, or food placement. When Oline was 14, she began teaching at the church school, not as the primary teacher when she was too young for that, but as an assistant who taught practical measurement to the younger students. She made every child measure a container of grain by weight and by volume. She made every child record the temperature at the schoolhouse door each morning and graph the results across a month. She did not limit these exercises to boys. The girls measured and recorded and graphed alongside them because Oline had watched her mother calculate survival with a pencil stub on wrapping paper, and she knew that measurement did not belong to any sex. It belonged to anyone who needed to eat through winter. Anders grew differently. He was quieter than his sister, shaped by the fever that had nearly killed him and by the memory of a father he could barely recall. He became a carpenter. His father's trade, absorbed not from Tolef directly, but from the tools and techniques he encountered while helping Marit build racks, repair cribbing, and construct the cellar doors that kept weather outside the rooms his mother had designed. He combined his father's carpentry with his mother's storage principles. He built above-ground ice houses with double walls and sawdust insulation. He built cellar doors with angled drainage channels that shed water instead of funneling it inward. He built ventilation cupolas for barns and warehouses. Each structure solved a moisture problem using the same principle Marit had taught him. Give water a path away, give air a path through, and measure the result. Marit replaced the original dugout with a modest frame house in the spring of 1885. The house was small, 2 rooms downstairs, a sleeping loft above them, but it was framed with sawn lumber, roofed with proper shingles, and oriented with the door facing south instead of north. She left the trapdoor. The original shaft still descended through the replaced floor into the sandstone chamber below. The chamber was too small now for the farm's full production. Marit had built a larger exterior cellar, a proper hillside vault with a stone-lined drain, divided humidity zones, and the second-generation ventilation system she and Aslak had designed for the demonstration cellar. But the original vault remained. She used it for seed storage, for tools vulnerable to rust, and for a few hams she cured each winter by the method her mother had taught her: salt, sugar, pepper, thyme, and a cool, dry room that never stopped moving air. She did not fill it in. She did not cover it. She did not disguise the trapdoor beneath furniture or carpet. When visitors came, and visitors came often, because the Brecka farm had become the place people brought their questions about storage, drainage, and preservation, Marit opened the trapdoor and let them descend the ladder into the original room. The cribbing was old now. Some timbers had been replaced. The walls showed the marks of Aslak's hammer and Marit's chisel, and the chalk lines they had drawn together during that first summer when the stone was new and the method was a gamble. She made visitors hold one hand near the low vent and the other near the high vent. "Feel the air move," she said. "If it is moving, the room is working. If it stops, something has changed, and you need to find out what." Every autumn, she opened the vault to neighborhood children and made them perform the same test. 2 hands, 2 vents, 1 question. Is the air moving? Some of the children remembered, some did not. The ones who remembered grew up to build cellars of their own, and the ones who did not grew up to hire someone who had. The communal cellar was enlarged twice in the years that followed, once in 1887 when 5 new families joined the cooperative, and once in 1892 when a severe drought made seed preservation more urgent than food storage. Each time, the builders preserved Aslak's original downhill drain. They replaced timbers, widened passages, added rooms, but the drain ran where it had always run, along the grade Aslak had calculated with his plumb bob and his mason's eye, and the water followed the path he had given it without deviation. Marit lived on the Firesteel Creek claim into her 70s. She slowed. The shoulder that had locked since 1880 grew worse each decade until lifting anything heavier than a sack of flour required a technique she had developed through pain and repetition. A rolling motion that used her body's momentum instead of her arm's strength. She walked the property each morning, checking the livestock pen, the garden, the exterior cellar, and the original vault. In the same order, at the same pace, the way a woman checks the rooms of a house she has lived in long enough to hear its silence change when something is wrong. In her final winter, Oline found her seated on a stool beside the open trap door, leaning slightly forward, her hands resting on her knees. "Mother," Oline said, "it is cold with the door open." "Listen," Marit said. Oline listened. From the shaft below came the sound of air moving through the vents. A low, constant whisper that had been present since the summer of 1880 and had never stopped. "The room still tells us when something has changed," Marit said. "It has been telling us for 40 years. We only needed to keep listening." Oline closed the trap door and helped her mother to bed. Marit died peacefully in a year that belongs to the story rather than to the historical record. The exact date does not matter. What matters is that she died in the house she built on the claim she held, within earshot of the room she dug with her own hands, when every voice around her said the ground would bury her. Oline kept Aslak's plumb bob, stone hammer, and notebooks together in the lower chamber of the original vault. She wrapped them in oilcloth and placed them on the shelf where the first cured hams had hung in the autumn of 1880, in air that had not stopped moving since her mother cut the vents and gave it a reason and a path. Within 4 years of the hard winter, 12 families had altered or replaced their storage cellars based on the sequence Marit taught. Watch where water travels, build above groundwater, drain before storing, separate foods by the conditions they need, control the movement of air, measure instead of assuming. A surviving copy of her sketch hung beside the communal cellar entrance. At the bottom, in her uneven handwriting, were 5 words: "Dry stone begins with dry ground." Marit Breke remained on the Firesteel Creek claim for the rest of her life. Every autumn she descended the original shaft and opened the vault to any child willing to hold 2 hands near 2 vents and feel the air move. She did not explain the physics. She did not lecture about moisture gradients or thermal mass. She placed a small hand near the low vent where cold air entered, and another near the high vent where warm air left. and she asked one question, "Do you feel that?" Aslak's plum bob hung from the ceiling nail where she had placed it the night he left for Wisconsin. It turned slowly in the draft and pointed straight down at the dry gravel sump, as it had every day for 40 years. Outside the Brecka dugout, the rescue trench still showed its outline in the snow. 3 men stood at the bottom with shovels lowered. Penfield held 3 woolen blankets. Crowell carried an inventory list of livestock and tools to be claimed from the dead. They had found a child's mitten frozen into the drift and believed the silence behind the wall was the silence of a house that had stopped needing heat. Then Penfield's shovel struck wood. He opened a gap the width of his hand, and warm air rose through it, carrying the smell of smoke, salt, and cured pork. He had stood beside the unfinished shaft months before and said, "That hole will keep nothing dry. It will bury the 3 of you before the snow does." Now he descended the ladder into a room where 6 hams hung dry. Squash lined the upper shelves in hard-skinned rows, and a gravel sump held no water. At the table above, Marit placed fried ham before men who had come expecting starvation. Outside, thaw water froze across the prairie, and ruined cellar doors stayed locked beneath brown ice. Beneath Marit's floor, 1 drop fell from the repaired shaft joint, struck the empty bucket, and stopped. The room stayed dry.